All right, well, it is 4:30, so I'm going to go ahead and share desktop one here. And I'm going to welcome everybody to the sixth unit of Giants. This one is over the Revolutionary War. It is one of my favorite units. And I'm going to dive right in because we know each other fairly well at this point in the year. I don't feel like I need to throw up a which cat are you today meme, especially since we have a lot of stuff to cover over the evening. But I am, as always, Dave, and I will be taking about half of the time tonight, and Phil will have about the other half of the time tonight. And as usual, when we are done, we will be done, and we will turn it over for anyone who wants to stay later for additional questions. But yeah, we are outlining this is the fifth of six rollouts, and tonight we are going to be going over Unit 6, which is the Revolutionary War. So, right out of the gate, you are probably going to notice that this unit is very different from all the other units that have come before it. And the first thing I'm going to draw your attention to here is you will see it is actually comprised of four lessons instead of our usual three. So this is a much larger unit. And actually, if you even pull open the old pacing guide, you'll see Unit 6 is supposed to take about 11 weeks of instruction, but do not freak out because I just saw a couple of you gasp a little bit there with the camera view. So this is a misleading statement. On the pacing view, it looks like this is supposed to take about 11 weeks, but it is misleading because it takes place, it goes through April. And as we all know, everybody's favorite thing ever takes place in April and sort of slows instruction down. What is a good chunk of April generally taken up by? Anybody? Anybody? Bueller.
Spring
Bueller.
break.
M step.
Testing and more
Oh,
testing.
Spring break is part of it, Leslie. You're correct on that. And
M
also
step.
MSTEP. Also MSTEP. So yeah, this is we're still going with the fifth graders take every test thing, which I think is fairly dumb, but it's the dumbness that we get to live. So yes, the most exciting period of time for every teacher and student in the state. It's certainly my favorite part of the school year, said no one ever. So four lessons total, and while the unit itself will probably take a little longer than the typical 6 weeks, we factored state testing and spring break into this unit. So when you look at the pacing view and see how big that is, don't freak out. We know that you're testing for a good chunk of that, and you're either adding more fun activities in for the kids or taking instruction slowly. So no worries there. The major question that we are focused with for this unit is the question, is revolution ever justified? This is a compelling question for a variety of reasons. First, it ticks that student-friendly language box. An academic, particularly a good friend of mine who I'm thinking of right now, might push for more. A good friend of mine, Patty, don't turn me in because it's a mutual friend we both have, but she likes really big, complex, compelling questions. And when Phil, she, and I sat down to develop the question for this unit, she wanted something like, what were the primary reasons why the colonists desired to separate from Europe? And, it's a good question for for someone in their 40s who loves social studies. But for a 10-year-old, when we want to hook a 10-year-old, we want a question that's a little more student friendly. So a question like that tends to lead towards a certain right answer. So that's another reason why it might not necessarily be a compelling question. So was or is revolution ever justified became the centerpiece of this particular unit. And this question also ticks another box that I found important with an inquiry question. Is it transferable? So to a certain degree, tomorrow night we've got the eighth grade teachers coming in to do the lead up to the Civil War and the first part of the Civil War. And to a certain degree, the Civil War was also a revolution. So we might revisit this question in a slightly different context in an eighth grade US history course. A sixth grade teacher might study modern revolutions as part of a world geography course. A high school teacher will definitely look at the sixth era of world history when teaching their world history course, and they can ask the same question about all the revolutions that took place across Europe and Asia. over those intervening years from what was covered in seventh grade. So, in short, this is a great question to center a unit around because it can be revisited time and time again. But students will get their first taste of this in fifth grade with this particular unit specifically. So that makes this a really important question to introduce and talk out with kids before you even begin to teach the unit. So our supporting questions this time around, you can see they're stacked here, but I'm going to actually take you through them in the lesson by lesson format here. Our first supporting question is, why did the colonists feel that they had the right to declare independence? So in lesson one, we introduced the first of two colonies game scenarios for students to grapple with. So the very well, right out of the gate, right after you've done your overview with students, we're going in and we're giving students the very first scenario for colonies, which this time around, I'm going to pull this up. You have been having an increasingly hard time dealing with all the new rules and regulations and taxes from your home country. How will you and your colonists respond to these increasingly unjust demands from a power so far away? So, I'm going to get a little bit more into this in just a second, but this is the same question as usual that the colonists themselves are going to grapple with and what they're studying. So that makes it a important one for students to think about. We get into some of the heavy hitters in this first lesson as well, in terms of reasons why the colonists felt they might want to declare independence. And in step two of the lesson, you will dive into several of the major, you will dial into several of the major acts that you were probably looking for at the tail end of Unit 5. So when we did Unit 5 last time, I said, I know you guys are looking for things like the Stamp Act and the Tax Act and things like that. And those were not in that unit because we bring them up here. We felt like this was a great place to include them. Although I did say you could steal these activities for the end of Unit 5 if you so wished. So if you did those already, you can skip them here. But basically, we're going to give students the Sugar Act to take a look at, the Stamp Act to take a look at, and the Tea Act and the Intolerable Acts. And if you have some higher students, Phil and I, the first time around, decided that the Declaratory Act is a great one to include, but not for all your students. So give this one to some of your higher flyers, some of your more gifted students to take a look at with some of these activities. But with this, you're going to dive into those major acts, and students will look at these things. And if there's another one that you like to teach that isn't included in this list, throw it in the mix. The whole purpose of these units is to be a foundation, foundational teaching piece for teachers who need that support and guidance. But if you have something that you use that you don't see in the curriculum proper, add it to the conversation. So either keep this activity and splice in the extra acts that you like to do, or teach this one as is. So again, that first colony scenario, you've been having an increasingly hard time dealing with all the new rules and regulations and taxes from your home country. How will you and your colonists respond to those increasingly unjust demands? We want students to grapple with and dissect the same issues that the colonists are facing at the time. This prompt should definitely get them talking. What you'll notice here is that they'll probably parallel many of the decisions that colonists make. When introducing this scenario, it's not scripted in giants, but a thing I like to do is tell students at the start of a class that there had been a major problem discovered by the school. And your school has to cut costs immediately. Like someone misplaced a decimal point and you thought you were going to end with all this money at the end of the school year, and it's much less. So the school's asking everyone to pitch in. And from this point forward, all homework, all tissues that you need to blow your nose, everything, you're going to have to charge for. So every homework assignment you give to students, that's going to cost about $1 a page. And tests, because you got to print those on super special paper, those are going to be about $2 per page. And you know those students that lose every paper you ever hand to them? You can nod. I know you all have them. I was that student when I was in school. If you have to give any of them an extra copy of something, it's going to be $5 per page. So, like, write all these numbers up on the board and tell students, going forward, Jana, you can say Cadillac Area Public Schools needs to cut costs. So, homework assignments, I got to charge you $1 per page now. And, put all these prices up on the board and then just say, so guys, any questions? And oh lordy, will the children have questions? They will have questions for you. Play along with this for a little bit, have some fun with this for a little bit, and then use it as a launch pad into the content. You can say, guys, I was kidding. I'm not going to charge you to blow your nose. I'm not going to charge you for extra homework assignments. This is, however, a problem that the colonists were facing in the social studies unit that we're about to roll into. So, doing something like that is great for getting the blood pumping in your students. And like I said, yes, they will have questions. They will be like, the more you get into prices, so feel free to extrapolate and go forward further. The more you get into the price of things and how much they're going to be charged for it, the more outraged they're going to be. And you can just say, look, I don't like these rules either, but it's what we have to do. We educate you here daily, and that costs a lot of money, and we just don't have it. So here you go. And what's sad is we live in a world where people might not be super surprised that we are having this conversation about charging for paper, even though we're not going to do that because public schools are still woefully underfunded, if you ask me. But so play along with this for a little bit and then use it as a launch pad. When I was teaching US history, a question I like to ask my students was, so when we look at the Bill of Rights, which of these amendments do you feel, oh, so that's closing. I'm sorry, I've moved on to step three, by the way. That's closing step two. And then step three, we are going to coalesce for a minute around the Quartering Act, because when I did teach eighth grade US history and we did do our Constitution unit, I asked students which amendments they felt were the most irrelevant and why. And eighth graders in particular usually went for the Quartering Act. Like they'd read this and they'd go, well, soldiers are never going to stay in our house. So, like, why do we have this amendment? And that's a really great launch pad into why do we have the Third Amendment to the Constitution and what does it mean? So, knowing that, we built step three of lesson one around policies that would lead to the inclusion of the Third Amendment in the hopes that students will see that this isn't a problem today, but it was definitely a problem back then. And then moving forward in this, we get into the Boston Massacre. And that's really going to culminate our prelude to war with students turning in their final answer to that first colony scenario of the unit. So after they've read, basically by the time you've made it through lesson one, students will be done with the first of the two colony scenarios for this grade level. We also then get into lesson two, which opens with something that I love to do with my review with my eighth graders that I included here as well. And that's the famous Longfellow poem about Paul Revere's ride. And there's an opportunity here to juxtapose what really happened on that ride for your students to compare with what's in the poem of, the interpretation of what happened on the ride. So it's good for a variety of reasons because here's another strong connection to your literacy block. Here's an opportunity for you to bring this in and study it in social studies class, and then practice some of the same things you might practice during your ELA block. And all the sources that we've provided you in this part of it give you a part of the story. And so students can start practice being historians themselves by looking closely at these accounts and using them to piece together their own account of what might have happened, right? What I love to say is that historians all agree that something happened, but historians can look at the same piles of evidence and they may not always agree on what it was that happened. So they can agree that something happened, but they may not always agree on what happened. So that's this is an opportunity for you to explain that to students and have them, talk about how their own interpretations from these sources might differ from one another's. And I want to be super clear that both the fifth grade units and the eighth grade units, neither one of these units will spend a great deal of time going from battle to battle to battle to battle to battle. Phil and I talked this out the very first time we ran these rollouts with the first versions of these units. And a common pattern that we see sometimes with social studies teachers is they go, oh, we've really got to walk students through every battle of these major wars. And we don't do that. So we do not take that approach. We take a holistic approach to studying the revolution in its entirety. And that does include some call outs to certain battles. But if you're wondering why Battle X wasn't listed anywhere in here, because in years past you've done a ton of work on this, feel free to bring some of that stuff that you may have done in the past into it. But We don't generally go from battle to battle to battle in Giants. The caveat is we do obviously in eighth grade talk about Battle of Gettysburg, and here in fifth grade we do talk about Lexington and Concord. Those are some pivotal, like you really can't study this without looking at these. So we do include some of those, but for the most part, we are not moving from battle to battle to battle. So lesson two is the early parts of this, and there's some stuff that we're going to highlight a little bit further going forward. When we get to lesson three, this is where we start to look at the contributions of others. So the question that lesson three is centered around is what contributions did other groups, and I have those in quotes, but what contributions did other various groups make during the war? And we kick this lesson off with a short burst project we've developed. There's a micro website that we created called With the Help of Others that helps introduce the topic of women in the Revolution, Indigenous peoples during the Revolution, and African Americans during the Revolution. So once students get some overview on the first page, and remember that AI is your friend if you need to compact the text to a different lexile or length, we then give them a sample list of people that they can research just a little bit further, and the project that this microsite is developed around also gives students some choice in what they do to answer the question that the project they're going to undertake is centered around. So during testing, this might be a really good activity to give students some predictability and creativity during test week. So they don't have to write a paper. They can build their own website. They can do a podcast. They can do a comic book. They can do whatever you want them to do, and you can open it up to allow them to sort of lean into their strengths. I like to tell the story, and Jana had both of my children, so she will know exactly which one I'm talking about when. But one of them is super into digital production. During the pandemic, I bought a new iPad that had a cellular data plan on it because we needed another device in the house that had internet connectivity. And I gave my eldest twin my old iPad at that point, so she'd have her own, and it had some video editing software on it, and I didn't teach her how to use it, but she came down 3 hours later one day and said, "Hey daddy, look at this thing that I made." And she'd made this beautiful video and she taught it to herself, and she loves doing this so much. This might actually be a career path for her. She's looking very strongly at when she hits high school, going to the Career Tech Center and doing the digital media, graduating with an associate's degree, which I love because there's, one less college tuition bill, and going to work for like 9 and 10 News, or going further and going out to Hollywood or things like that. So Twin, the eldest, when given free choice in a project, will always choose to go that route. And my youngest twin, they both love art, but my youngest twin loves art so much that she would probably tackle it through like a graphic novel or a comic book or things like that. So give students some choice in the project because it's going to be kind of a during testing for them. Yes, they're doing research, but they get to sort of lean in and do what they want to do for it. And you can take your time with it, right? Like you can go, I guess we're working on our projects again today, guys. And, you can take some time. So there's another part of that 11 weeks. Jana, do you know which one is which when I'm telling you? I see you nodding there. So, yep, gotcha. They loved Mrs. Mulder. We got so many Mrs. Mulder stories every day. So,
Aw, I love that.
all good things too, I promise. So, the final question that we get into for the unit is lesson four. And the final question is, what were the consequences of the war for both sides? So this lesson will close out our study of the revolution, and it sets the stage for that final unit that we'll talk about next time. We introduced the second colony simulation here. Students are asked, regardless of which side they supported during the war, how do they intend to rebuild and regroup after the war has ended? Our final unit is going to move into the Articles of Confederation and the Constitutional Convention. So it'll be very interesting to see how students grapple with that immediate aftermath of the war. So this is a really comprehensive unit. There's a lot of moving parts. And with that out of the way, we're going to move into our final stomp into the war here by taking a look at some of the acts and taxes and tea. Oh my, that made up this particular section. Before I do that, however, I'm going to pause the recording for just a moment, if I can figure out where that is. Zoom recording. And we can move into the very first activity here. So the first part of things is starting to delve into all of these wonderful reasons why the colonists wanted to break up with Great Britain. So this next activity is kind of twofold. It's designed to get students familiar with some of the major taxes imparted on the colonies by Britain, as well as to give them an opportunity to do a little bit of project-based work. So the project piece, like I said before with the other one, is important this time of year because students are going to be testing heavily. And projects can be a nice break. It gives them something creative they feel like they can, have some control over, and it's not quite as intense always as some of the other in-class activities. So basically, to start this off, students are going to work in small groups on a jigsaw, which will have each group producing by the end a small poster or electronic display that is part of a classroom timeline of events that lead up to the Revolutionary War. We like to, and we've linked them out to Britannica.com, which it's fascinating to me because this all used to be behind a paywall. And you can still subscribe to Britannica and get more, get more info. But back in the day, like Microsoft Encarta was a thing, Britannica was a thing, and as they transitioned away from books and they had the CD-ROMs and then went online, it all anything that was online was hidden behind a paywall. And then Wikipedia bursts onto the scene as this free encyclopedia entry. And over time, it's forced all of these places like Britannica to rethink their own business models. So I don't even think you can buy a set of printed Encyclopedia Britannica books anymore, which kind of makes me sad because we all have those memories as a kid of researching using our ancient set of encyclopedias from home to, get the first round of information before we head out to the library and the card catalog. And I don't think I even remember how to search for things using the Dewey Decimal System anymore, but like all of these ways that we researched and did this work is so much easier for students today, and I don't think they appreciate that. So feel free to tell that when I was your age story if you need to when you're introducing this project. But we send them out to Britannica because it's clear the Lexiles are generally the wording is not too out there for students, but if need be, you can take some of this text and run it through an AI as well. I have become a really big fan of Magic School AI for the text leveler feature. And while the free account is limited in certain things, I have still found workarounds away around most of it. So feel free to take some of this text and chomp it down further if need be, but it's still a really good accessible version for kids to read to start to learn about each of these different acts. So we've got the Sugar Act here. We also have the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the Declaratory Acts, and the Intolerable Acts. So students are going to work in a jigsaw, and they're going to be able to use these sites to begin to learn about their act and figure out where their date on the timeline is going to be overall. And at the end of a couple of class periods, after they put all this together, they'll present their final project to the class, and they'll add their portion of the timeline to the classroom timeline. As each group presents on their act or tax, discuss with students, like have this conversation. What might those reactions have been from the colonists? How might they feel about this? So I'm charging you $1 per page thing that I told you to do, which please do. And please tell me how it goes when we're together. And I love these stories. Patty's chuckling because I think she shared on this one the last time we did this. Patty, do you remember anything about what your kids usually say from that? I'm going to put you on the spot. I didn't prep you for this.
That's okay. Usually they just get really ticked off. And then they look at me like, you're kidding, right? Like this couldn't be happening to me. Everything's free. And yeah, it's a good reaction for sure. I
Nice.
love it.
So
Especially for those children who lose things all the time like you did.
I was
It drives the point.
I was horrible. And some of my new teachers that I work with, they're like, if you were that student, Dave, tell me what would have worked. Like nothing. Like I had one that was ready to staple it to my forehead and I still lost it, so all right. So this is an opportunity as each group presents to ask the students, so how did the colonists react to this? How do you think the colonists would react to this? And this builds their answer to the colony simulation. So you might want to introduce the key points by providing some background information on some of those tax acts that were imposed by Britain on the colonies. But one thing that I think is a common misconception of students is I think students think that taxes were only put out there for monetary reasons, but a question you might choose to ask the students is, does a tax just mean money, or could it also be about control and regulation? And see what they think. Just because a tax is obviously a way for an entity to recoup money that it may have spent, like Britain did on the French and Indian War. But it's also a great way of, well, we've got this tax, we've got to pay for it, and this is how it's going to go, and you're going to pay it, darn it. So there is a level of control and regulation that goes along with this as well, that would be beneficial to talk about with your students. When you are ready to turn your students loose, I'm a huge fan with my social emotional learning work. I'm a huge fan of setting norms and rules for group work and classwork. And you may have done this already. I know elementary teachers, anytime I present on SEL, elementary teachers are like, yep, we've been doing that for years. It's part of the elementary mantra. So this is sometimes a light bulb moment for secondary teachers and not for elementary teachers because you naturally do some of these things. But think about setting some norms for group work if you don't have any already, and just say, hey, what should the noise level be in our classroom when we're working together? What should you do if you have a question? And develop these norms for group work with your students, and then reuse them on the rest of the group activities, both in this unit and your other core contents. But um, once you've set those expectations for group work and collaboration, I recommend modeling and providing some examples of how to research and present information effectively. Every grade level always thinks, from kindergarten all the way up to high school, that, oh, well, kids know how to do this already because they had to have done it in fourth grade, or they had to have done it in third grade, or they had to have done it in second grade. And they do these things in those grade levels, but it's always good to give the refresher, because the Dave Johnsons of the world, who are sometimes absent that day, maybe never picked up how to take notes properly. So model for them how to do some of this research, like even down to, hey, let's go line by line on the first couple paragraphs of the tax or the Stamp Act here. Is this an important piece of information that should be in your flyer? Yes or no? Why or why not? And have some of those conversations. So the final product that kids will develop with this should include details about the act, reactions to it, and the British motivations for passing it. And for the closing part of this activity, have each group present their timeline posters to the class and summarize those key takeaways while you guys are doing some of that discussion. If you wanted to, you might create an extension activity where students research and analyze an additional text, maybe that wasn't mentioned, but maybe it still had a significant impact on the lead up to the Revolutionary War. But that is just if you need it. And then after this activity, we get a little bit more into the Quartering Act, which was another major bone of contention with students. You can continue on your school budget scenario here by saying that, okay, so the paper thing was a bust. You're right. I made that up. It's not true. But the school can't afford to pay teachers as much as they used to. So we've got to cut teacher pay. And what they've decided is that all teachers are going to have to move in with one of their student families. Yes, I'm getting the appropriate chuckles that I was hoping I would get from this. I am serious. You will have the same types of conversations. You will have a couple of fifth graders that'll go, wait, Mrs. Owens was lying about the paper thing. I'll bet she's lying about this too. But go forward, like say that teachers have to live with students to ensure not only that teachers have a place to live, but that students have extra instructional opportunities outside of the school day. Yes, yes, those words exactly. I'm seeing more chuckles. And several of you have your cameras off, which is fine. And I can see you chuckling behind your off cameras as well. Um, Pick a student at random. Use any different method, but pull a student's name at random and just say, Phil, how big is your guest room? And they may not even have a guest room. And if that's the case, if Phil says, well, I don't have a guest room, Dave, then you could go, okay, how big is your room? Because I think that's probably where I'll stay. I'll just stay in your room and you can sleep on the couch, or you can move in with your brother, or you know what, the weather we're getting in March is so nice you could sleep outside with the dog, but just explain to them that you're moving in at the end of the week and you're going to be bringing your things with you. And if the student protests, you just got to remind them, you know what? You are getting a free education every single day. And that is just not sustainable for everywhere, forever. Everyone is going to have to make some sacrifices over time, gang. And that, Phil, you are the first student who will have to pay that price. And just continue that charade for a little while. Be like, well, my favorite food is hamburgers, so you're going to have to make sure that you make me hamburgers at least once a week. Also, a huge fan of macaroni and cheese, so let's get some mac and cheese on the menu every night as well. And students may be able to get behind that. So that's when you go, and I have to have Brussels sprouts with every meal. So, you better just, Phil, why aren't you writing this down? You got to take this list home to your mom because I'm moving in on Friday. This is the thing that's got to happen. Um, Play this one out for as long as you can play this one out as well. And then use this as a way to springboard into the quartering act. And we've got some discussion questions. You can see the discussion question list that is here. I'll pull up real quick. So after students have read about the quartering act and they realize that you are no longer actually going to be moving in with them at the end of the week, talk to them. So what was the British perspective on the quartering act? Why did the British think that this was fair? And the answers to that are in the reading. But, again, we have all these troops from Britain over in the New World and they need a place to stay. And you've got all these colonists with homes. And you know what? They were over there to defend them. So it's only fair that they stay there, right? And then what was the colonial perspective on the Quartering Act? Why did they think that this was unfair? And then students get to, you can use this as a mini debate opportunity if you want to. Students get to go, okay, who was right, the British or the colonists? And explain your answer. And then this final one, this is another one of those times where we live in such an interesting time. I don't know. I don't know. We wrote this question, Phil, in 2017, I think, and now today, I just don't know. But could something like the Quartering Act still be passed today? Why or why not? Most of your students don't know about the Third Amendment yet. I brought that up because I teach about it in eighth grade, or I taught about it in eighth grade. But this is a great opportunity to actually point out the Third Amendment to the Constitution, which again will help you with your M-STEP because there's usually a question or two on the creation of the Constitution. So have a little mini slide in here to prep them for that question. But these discussion questions, you'll have some time and you'll have some fun with. So after that, students will read a little bit more about the Quartering Act. We've got these discussion questions. I've got an AI enhanced version for you to use if you have some students that may need. And remember, anytime you see AI enhanced, it means this is a first round. It's never been part of Giants before, but we took the article on the Quartering Act and we, took it down. I used Magic School for this one. We took it down so that it's a little bit easier to understand for some students. I think I put this one at a third grade level. So you've got some fifth grade students who are reading at a third grade level. This is the version to give them. So we then move into everyone's other favorite standbys, a little bit on the Boston Massacre and a little bit on the Boston Tea Party. So we have students first take a look at the section on the Boston Massacre in the Michigan Open Book Materials. There's a brief reading guide. That's kind of a really nice add-on, a value add for the Giants units, is that we develop some reading guides to go along with the sections of open book that we are concerned with here. So we've got this reading guide that kind of guides students to some of the bigger ideas. Once that's done, you can have a brief discussion on the Boston Massacre. And then we have this special skill understanding different activity or different perspectives activities on page 122 of Open Book. And that's a great one to do verbatim with students, the whole class. Have students take a blank sheet of paper or an empty Google Doc or a one-row table with two columns. Have them view video A from Open Book and discuss whether or not they believe it was a portrayal of the British perspective or the colonial perspectives. Many students may end up saying some of the same things as you discuss, but the idea is to get students looking at how one person's perspective can shape a retelling of an event. Then turn over and do video B and do that same activity, and then conclude by asking students to consider which portrayal of these events they believe to be the most accurate and why. And then when it comes to the Boston Tea Party activities, you can do this part in any order, but we recommend having students first read about the Boston Tea Party and its immediate aftermath in section 6 of Open Books, 5th grade text. Again, we've got that reading guide in there, and students have already done some report out and some, activities centered around those various acts. And then finish with a story time. I took a portion of Johnny Tremaine. When I taught 8th grade ELA, I used to teach Johnny Tremaine at the same time that my counterpart who took over social studies for me was teaching his like 5th grade review unit at the start of the year. And what's great is it is a fictional account, but it involves these same people that students are learning about. So like you get to meet Paul Revere, you get to meet John Adams, you get to meet all of these big names from the Sons of Liberty. So we've attached a portion of Johnny Tremaine. Read it aloud with your students. Get them down on the floor. Have it be story time. That doesn't have to disappear just because they're in the upper elementary. Bring them down. Read that section. One quote that I really love near the end of it, well, boys, said a voice so cold one hardly knew whether he spoke in anger or not. You've had a fine, pleasant evening for your Indian caper, haven't you? But mind, you've got to pay the fiddler yet. So this is a quote coming from the section on the Boston Tea Party, which is the section we provided for you. And it's a great quote for further study and discussion with your students. And then we also have Liberty's Kids there as well. Again, a nice little break for students if the need arises. So this is a great way to close that portion of the lesson. And then we move into Phil. I think I'm running a couple of minutes behind. My apologies, but you'll make it up. I'll make it up. We got it. We then move into a piece, if I can find the right tab here, on the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. So this is a fun pause. Much has been written, discussed, and debunked about Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, but of all the different accounts that are available, all of the ones that we've included here are an excellent way to illustrate for students how historians can agree that something happened, but they don't always agree on the what. When the authors of this unit was growing up, he was frequently read this little golden book that contained an illustrated version of The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. I remember my dad had this great timbre in his voice when he'd read it to me. I loved it. I would ask him to read this one so many nights. So imagine my surprise later in life when that account, which I had listened to all the time growing up and I'd taken as fact, got overturned by the truth of things. So, begin class one day with that guided read aloud. Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere. Very famous words. I've had them memorized forever. And then have students go through again and highlight or circle parts of the narrative that they've heard before. There may be very little, but the idea is to put the famous Longfellow poem in the hands of kids and dissect what they can about the events of the day by tearing the account apart a bit. And then go ahead and take a look at some of the other artifacts here, like what really happened, the Paul Revere Museum, and the Johnny Tremaine selection again on the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere as well. All of these are different accounts. Two of them are fictional, one of them is a historical one, but all of them have some elements of what happened, and all of them differ in certain areas as well. So again, take this opportunity to really discuss with students how history is hard to pinpoint sometimes. And it's hard to break down exactly what happened and when. So once you've discussed all of that, take a look at some of those other sources. There's actually also a really cool virtual tour that you can sign up for, whether you have the VR goggles or not. A friend of mine shared this with me. I hope it's still here. Oh, darn it. I lost it. I will share it some other time. It wasn't on the agenda for tonight, but you can actually go into Independence Hall and look around and scroll up and down, and it gives you a 360 view. And so I will try at the break or when I turn things over to Phil to find this, and I'll open up with it again. But the broader question for study here is, why is Paul Revere so revered? And why don't we hear so much about Dawes and Prescott and some of those other folks that were also part of it? So you'll have an opportunity to study all these folks with your students. And we have this cool document analysis piece on who fired the first shot that's available in here. And students will look at several different primary accounts from people who lived in the Revolutionary War describing that first shot that was fired. And the ultimate aims here are have students read these accounts and come up with their own opinion, make their own claim supported with evidence about who fired first and what evidence supports that. And then use that to have a larger discussion on does it matter who fired the first shot? So this is one of history's great mysteries. Did the British fire first or did the colonists? And does it really matter who fired first? Because this, we all know this powder keg was going to explode either way. So that is it for me for this first portion. I am almost right on time. And Phil is going to take over sharing from me now for a minute, and he's got a Revolution Fort set. Then we'll have break, and he'll come back with naval battles. So, Phil, take it away, my friend. And everybody, thank you for listening to me prattle on for 45 minutes without stopping. I apologize for that. Take it away, Phil.
I lost where to unmute it here. So you should see Revolutionary War Fort up on the screen. Yes, no, somebody?
Yes, I see it.
Yeah, okay. This is here partly because we're in a section of the course where there's a lot of reading involved, but we're also in the middle of winter. And some of the days tend to be a little bit cold and a little bit dreary, or they're changeable, or all of that. It's also a way to review the game that we did back at the beginning about where do we locate a settlement here. And this, we've done this in every one of the grades to have a period of time roughly in the middle of the class to have another one of these where do we put something games. And the purpose of the game is partly to give some factual information, but it's also to give you a chance to diagnose how much kids have picked up over the course of the year about map reading. So I don't need to spend a lot of time with the beginning of this game because you've already done one of them. It's a real place at a real time in history. You can try to figure out where it is, but we really want to focus on a somewhat more important question. And that is, how do people decide where to locate a fort, where to pick a battle site, where to store our things at a particular moment in history. So the goal is to think about how you're making a decision. You're looking for a place to build a fort sometime during or after the French and Indian War. You do not have a cell phone or any of the other modern tools that you've got. What you do have is a somewhat more detailed map than you had last fall when we played one of these games. And the task for the students is a little bit more detailed, that the activity they get asks them to specifically name some advantages and drawbacks from each location that's marked by a letter. Now, this is where it's really awkward when we're doing this as a Zoom thing, because I can't be watching everybody's face and the rest of their body language quite as well. And you can't answer as fast. The chat room just doesn't work very well. So we can't play the game right now. But I want to underscore that the purpose of the game is not just the factual information or the aha at the end of it. It's to give you a chance to diagnose how much your students have learned about map reading and things like that. But that being said, you've got a choice of 8 locations, A through H, that you might want to locate a fort. And my question for you is, where would you put that fort? And if you happen to have an idea looking at that map right now, draw the letter up there or give me the number, A is 1, B is 2, C is 3, and so on. Where do you think would be the best place for it sometime between the French and Indian War and the Revolution? Now, the website has got an activity page that asks the students to do exactly what I did. They have to write down an advantage and a disadvantage for each one of these locations. And it gives you two answers here as models. You can model one or two more in class and then throw it open for a kind of a Socratic discussion. Or you can have them actually write out, like they're going to have a message to the commander. I think the fort ought to be located in such and such a place, and make a writing activity out of it. The packet of materials that's on the website has got a teacher's guide that lists an advantage and disadvantage for each one of these locations. It also has two maps that you can either print or display. If you let your eyes go back and forth between those two maps, can you make a generalization about troop movements and about fort locations and about, just where did things happen in the Revolutionary War in the North? And you can spend as much time or as little time as you want on that, because when we actually start talking about one of these forts, we're going to actually get into that a little bit. And finally, the handout packet that you've got up on the website has got the current map that they use in the course on war strategy and tactics at West Point. That this is part of the West Point Atlas of military history, and it's got details about it. And I'll bring it back again after the break when we talk about one specific battle. And then finally, the last page in the handout packet is a list of the battles along with some hot links, so that if you wanted to make an independent inquiry out of this, you can assign different students different battles to look at, and then they've got an immediate hot link where they can get information about that. Like Dave said earlier, we don't want to make the course battle by battle. We're going to spend 6 weeks talking about the chronology of the war. In fact, we're only going to talk about two of them. And the two that we're going to pick to choose to talk about are not the ones that your Glicks have as listed as the turning points. So with that, I go back to, here's the map of the area. What are the advantages and drawbacks of each one of these locations? And like the original map, the game that you did back in September, this one has got a real answer to it. When you rotate this map 90 degrees, it is a part of upstate New York. And what was called the North Mountain and the South Mountain become the East Mountain and the West Mountain, or the Green Mountain and the Adirondacks over here. And place D turned out to be the location of the fort. Now, the French built that at place D because it had a number of really important advantages. First of all, it controlled the only road between these two lakes. And where it is located, it could shoot both north and south at enemy ships on the lakes for quite a distance up the lake. And it had a river flowing right by it, which provided water. And meanwhile, the swamps around it made it very hard to attack by an army on foot. Now, that river is not navigable. It does show 3 rapids and a waterfall on it. There's no way that they're ever going to take a boat along that river, but there was a road next to it. So that's a real fort. And it was built by the French. 4 years later, the British took it. 15 years later, the Americans took it. 2 years after that, the British took it back. 4 years after that, they just left. Because something happened over that 20-year period, turns out to be really important for how the Revolutionary War worked. So let's take a look at that more elaborate map of all of northeastern North America. And you can see that Ticonderoga is like a cork in the pipe. It's like a blockage in your sewer system. If you could hold Ticonderoga, you could prevent an army moving down from Canada to New York. So Ticonderoga was an extremely important macro location. Interestingly enough, is that there was another fort, Fort Stanwix, that the Americans had built in the Mohawk River Valley to kind of guard that east-west valley. And that also gives me a chance to say something about there had to have been somebody that was thinking ahead to realize that we're going to need to build a fort in this location here. And it's kind of like I'm taking my hat off to the engineers that were busy constructing these forts in these locations. And then finally, there was another fort at a place called West Point, which is where some hard rocks cross the Hudson River and make the Hudson River very narrow. So you notice how we've got forts located in each one of those narrow valleys. That's going to turn out to be really important in how the Revolutionary War played out in the North. Now, today, Ticonderoga is just a really popular tourist attraction. And I used to run teacher workshops there. I think we ran 5 different workshops in the fort itself. People dress up in the clothes of soldiers. And so you get this bizarre scene where you've got a line of troops marching along over here, and then a great big long line of tourists over there watching the cannon demonstration, and a couple other tourists that are around taking pictures in different places. It's a tourist attraction. The museum, however, is absolutely spectacular. If you do have a chance to go there, it's got all kinds of maps and artifacts from that old fort. The surrounding swamps, like we already said, makes it almost impossible to attack this fort by land. You just can't bring horses or cannons or anything like that. And even if you're trying to walk across it, you're going to be going very slowly. The cannons themselves are aimed to control the lakes, and they were huge cannons. That's going to turn out to be part of the story here, because this cannon that you're looking at right in front weighs 1,700 pounds. I mean, there is no way that you're going to actually move this thing around when your armies are moving. The photo also shows why the fort was abandoned. When the fort was built, nobody could get a gun up onto the top of that ridge that would be able to shoot all the way down. But over that 25-year period, they developed a different generation of cannons, and the British put a couple of them up on the top. And at that point, the fort went from being an almost impossible to attack place to a place that was extremely vulnerable. That the British could just sit up here and slowly turn the fort into rubble and kill everybody inside of it without having to risk anybody at all. So that's Ticonderoga. It had great connections, located in the only way that you could go north and south from Canada down into New York City. And that is the only direct way. But it had really bad conditions when new cannons were invented and brought into this war. The Americans, when they finally decided that they couldn't defend Ticonderoga, they retreated southward, and they made a stand near a town called Saratoga. That was helped tremendously by the fact that another British army had been stopped near Fort Stanwix, which is a similar cork over there in the Mohawk Valley. And a third British army had been stopped near Bennington. So we had one battle at Ticonderoga that turned out not to be a battle, that we simply abandoned it. We had a battle that was a key one near Fort Stanwix, and another one near Fort Bennington. Then you go to what your Glick say is the turning point in the war at Saratoga, and you know that it was not a key battle in the war. In fact, there were only 60 people killed in it. Both the Bennington and the Stanwix battles involved nearly 500 people killed. What Saratoga was the inevitable end of a series of battles for control of the gaps between these highlands. And when the Americans won the Battle of Stanwix and the Battle of Bennington, they made it impossible for the British to reinforce the army at Saratoga. So the actual, quote, Battle of Saratoga went on for months, during which time the British were slowly using up their ammunition and starving to death. And the end of it was that 6,000 of them surrendered. But they didn't surrender because they were defeated in battle. They surrendered because two other battles had made Saratoga an impossible place for the British Army to be. Oh, I should say, actually, three other battles, because the British Navy tried to go up the Hudson River to resupply the army, and the Americans cut them off at West Point. So you remember the names Ticonderoga, Stanwix, Bennington, and West Point. They're like the four sides of a cross, and Saratoga just happens to be the place in the middle. The conclusion is the same as it was last fall. If you look at history, as the result of the decisions that people made at a particular time in their environment and with the technology that they had at the time, that engages a lot more brain power and you can remember it better. So the location of just about every fort and battle in the northern part of the Revolutionary War, in fact, in just about any war, is likely to make more sense when you look at it through the eyes of the people who chose that location. So with that, I've taken a look at the Glicks that say the turning points in the war were Saratoga and Yorktown. And I said, yeah, Saratoga was a turning point, but it wasn't the key battle. The key battles were fought for the control of the gaps that lead into Saratoga. And Saratoga itself was just kind of the play out. And after the break, we're going to take a quick look at Yorktown and then reopen that question that David raised about who was helping us. Because in both the Battle of Stanwix and Bennington, both sides of the army, about half of the army consisted of Native Americans. Well, let's leave it like that. I've got 5:29, so that means we reconvene at 5:34 to continue on from here.
Sounds good, Phil. We'll see you back here at 5:34, everybody. All right. Welcome back, everybody. It is 5:34, and Phil is going to pick up where he left off with Battle of Kings Mountain. Well, Kings Mountain. Kings Mountain, not necessarily the Battle of Kings Mountain.
Hey,
I made it a point to say we're not doing battles, and then I'm like, oh, let me introduce a battle. So, Phil, there you go.
I think we probably will do a battle here. Like I say, we're talking a little bit about the Glicks. We're talking about who helped us. And one of the intriguing things about Kings Mountain is who was involved there. Because who was involved at Kings Mountain tells you a lot about what the Revolutionary War was really about. And a lot of people who are born north of the Mason-Dixon line or went to school there don't even have a clue what Kings Mountain is all about. So it just might be that some people are going to find out a little bit about something that they hadn't heard about before. The American Revolution was a very complicated thing. 2,000 men fought in one key battle, but only one of them was a British soldier. And this was supposed to be a revolution against the British. Only one of them was a British soldier. The outcome of the battle often depended on how well the weapons and tactics fit the local geographic conditions of what was going on. You knew I would have to say something like that since I'm a geographer by training, not a historian. This map comes from a textbook that's used at the Army School in West Point, and we gave you a copy of that in the packet of materials that you've got. What the map very clearly shows is that the Revolutionary War had two very different parts to it. In the North, what we talked about before the break, the key battles were for control of the ocean ports, Boston and New York, and to a lesser extent, Providence, and the key locations along big rivers, along Lake Champlain, along the Hudson River, along the Mohawk River, along the Shenandoah River, and so on. And so you can see the battles are all kind of lined up. By contrast, in the South, the battles seem to be scattered all over the place. There aren't any big rivers. There weren't any really important ports at the time. The battles were really just scattered all over the place. And then things kind of came to an end at a place that is roughly halfway in between these two. And that becomes a big part of the story. It's like when Washington and Rochambeau and a few other folks like that came south from New York in order to meet Cornwallis, who was coming north from the south. And they wound up at Yorktown. It's called a turning point. But I think the real battle happened a little bit earlier. In fact, it happened twice. One of them was at Kings Mountain. So I won't even call the Yorktown a battle. I just call it a siege. It's an attempt to capture a fort without much actual fighting. Now I know Dave's going to be all uptight because Alexander Hamilton led one of the attacks on one of the redoubts, and we all know that that's going to have to become important like that, and that's true. But let's go back and figure out what was really going on. One army surrounds the other and waits for them to surrender. It's as simple and as complicated as that. So let's zoom in a little bit closer and look at the mess that you would have to call the war in the South. And we're going to look specifically at one battle, Kings Mountain, because some people call this the actual turning point in the war. This is when the war stopped being a civil war and started to become a war for independence. Before Kings Mountain, the British side had won nearly all of the battles in the South. But I'm being very careful in how I'm choosing my words here. It's the British side, not the British. Because at Kings Mountain, the British Army consisted entirely of loyalists, led by one British officer. The British were buying things like pine tar, indigo, rice, tobacco from the South, and as a result, many Southerners were part of the British Army as loyalists. In the South, it was even more dramatically a civil war than it was up in the North. But even in the North, the Battle of Bennington, it was predominantly a civil war. That there were loyalists on the British side, a substantial part of that army. Oh, and about 1,000 Germans. Like I say, in the South, well, let's go on. The British had bought two groups of people from the South. The planters who wanted to sell them something, and then the British offered freedom to any slave as long as that slave belonged to a rebel who would escape and join the British Army or Navy. And that turned out to be somewhere around 35,000 of them. At Kings Mountain, Major Ferguson was a British officer. He was the leader of about 1,100 loyalist soldiers and about 300 Native Americans and about 200 ex-slaves that had joined that. In other words, an army that consisted entirely of Americans with one British soldier involved in it. He chose a campsite according to standard military doctrine at the time, and that is to choose the high ground. And the map shows, the Park Museum shows the locations of Kings Mountain there. Three British armies were planning to join together after their battles, and then they were going to go north in order to finish off this upstart named George Washington. General Cornwallis had won his battle at Canton. General Tarleton had won the battle at Laxhaws. And then you had Ferguson at Kings Mountain. He had a problem, however. Canton and Laxhaws were on kind of flat land. But his army had decided to choose a location on the top of this mountain. And usually it's a great place to be. You know, if you're on the high ground, the enemies have to work hard to climb uphill to get to you, and you can shoot down on them. So what made Kings Mountain different? And what made Kings Mountain different is going to wind up telling us what's going to happen at Yorktown. So in the packet of handout materials, you've got a data page about the guns that were used in the Revolution. And there were basically two major kinds of them. And the activity here is, you know, if you're going to go hunting, which one do you want? If you're standing in line, which one do you want? If you're kneeling, you know, and so on. When you look at them side by side, it's very hard to tell much difference between a musket and a rifle. The big difference is on the inside. The barrel of a musket is a long steel pipe. It's almost why a musket is always longer than a rifle back in the Revolutionary War time. That's why it's called a smoothbore. You can load a musket with a big lead ball or with a bunch of smaller little balls called buckshot, or you can combine them. And interestingly enough, General Washington had sent a message out to the army that you ought to load your muskets with buck and ball loads. You ought to have one big ball in front and then three little ones behind it. And that was going to help you out in the biggest problem with a musket. And that is that it's fairly easy to load, but it is just terrible for accuracy. At the distance of 100 yards, the length of a football field, half of your shots will miss a target that's 5 feet high and 2 feet wide. Now, the vulnerable part of a person is only about 2 feet high and 1 foot wide, so it means your chances of hitting somebody at that distance are almost nil. So why bother to use muskets in a battle? And the answer is it's very easy to keep clean, and you can train somebody to use it in a hurry. And when they're trained, they can fire 3 to 4 shots a minute. Now remember, each shot has got 4 balls in it, so now we're talking about somewhere between 12 and 16 pieces of lead that are flying through the air. So the other weapon that's a possibility is a rifle. It's got long grooves inside it. The grooves make the bullet spin like a football spiral, and that means it's going to go straighter. A rifleman in the late 1700s could hit an enemy soldier 9 out of 10 times 100 yards away. Now, who has a rifle is somebody who's hunting. And that was basically the Americans. So when people talk about, the two armies and what kind of equipment that they have, and they want to make it like, well, the Americans just had the equipment that they had for hunting, whereas the British had actual military weapons. The answer is that the thing that you used for hunting was a whole lot more accurate than the military weapon was. So why not use only rifles in the battle? Because A, it is extremely hard to clean, and you basically have to clean it after every 2 or 3 shots. A dirty barrel makes loading very hard, in fact, almost dangerous, because you got little specks of fire that might still be inside that barrel. And even with a clean gun, it takes 3 to 4 times as long to load one bullet. And it takes a whole lot longer to train somebody to shoot accurately. So do the math. 2 or 3 lines of soldiers, 1 row shooting, 1 to 2 loading. Using the buck and ball loads, can fire about 15 times as many bullets toward the enemy in a minute. On an open battlefield, 3 rows of musketeers were much more effective than a group of riflemen. That's the reason that the British loyalists had won almost all of the earlier battles in the southern colonies. Now, this is a really weird picture there, too. Army commanders had known all over the world about the advantages of having musketeers in rows. This drawing is from a Chinese training book from the mid-1600s. And it basically has 1 row of riflemen up in the front. When they made a painting of Baron von Steuben, training the Americans at Valley Forge, they were learning how to stand in line, aim and fire, and then walk back a couple steps and reload while the next row moved forward to shoot. And with training, 12 soldiers with muskets can fire more than 150 bullets toward the enemy. Oh, and let me just do one more thing here, since I got a second. The command at the time was not ready, aim, fire. The command was ready, level, fire. Nobody even bothered to try to aim a musket. All you did was held it level and hoped that you had enough bullets flying in the other direction that you might hit something. It's one of the reasons why Lexington and Concord did not have very many casualties, is that they were standing 100 yards apart and they couldn't hit anything at that range. So 12 soldiers with muskets can fire a whole lot of bullets toward the enemy in a minute. Who cares if half of them miss? You do. If you're camped on the top of a small mountain and your enemy is a bunch of backwoods hunters who have accurate rifles and have you completely surrounded. And that's what made Kings Mountain so interesting. In the museum, the park that's there, and again, it's a great park to go visit. Kings Mountain was more assailable by the rifle than defensible with the bayonet. On 3 different times, the British tried to charge down out of the mountain. And the Patriot riflemen, really good hunters from the frontier, were just hiding behind the trees. They were 200 yards downhill. And when the British charged down, and again, in the museum, they've got a painting of that going on, the Loyalist muskets just couldn't hit them. When they tried to charge down the hill, the Patriots just ran farther downhill, where more of the riflemen were standing there and waiting to shoot. In short, it was a place where one army had weapons that did not fit the geographic conditions at all. And as a result, they wound up with a whole lot more casualties. The Patriots had 90 casualties total, 28 were killed. The Loyalists up on the mountain had 290 killed, 163 wounded, and the rest of them surrendered when they saw how hopeless the situation was. Now, why do I call this a turning point? Oh, and another thing in passing. The sharpshooter of the American Army was a guy named Isaiah Bowman, African-American, free African-American. He fired the bullet that killed the British commander. The Battle of the Kings Mountain was a turning point. British General Cornwallis now realized that it would be much harder to get loyalists to fight on the British side. And when that happened, his army shrunk by 2/3. Southern slaves no longer believed in the British promise of freedom, so they deserted en masse. Cornwallis's plan to recruit loyalists and slaves to divide the colonies had failed completely. He retreated north to Virginia to a place called Yorktown. And by the time he got to Yorktown, 1/4 of Washington's army was African American, including a number of them who had fought at Brandywine and at Kings Mountain. So like I say, we've now looked at that. Let me review that PowerPoint that I briefly showed last week, and I'm going to add 5 more frames at the end of that. because the real key to Yorktown was not the siege itself. The key to Yorktown was what was going on with the navies. So in this presentation, we're looking at old paintings. The one I showed you last time did not have this picture over here, but it is an important fact. The British Navy had 89 ships of the line on duty between 1755 and 1785. HMS Victoria is a first-rate ship of the line, 3 decks, 104 guns, and a crew of 850. So if we've got like 90 ships of the line and they have maybe 800, you've got an awful lot, like 7,000 sailors that you need. And then a bunch of those got involved at Chesapeake Bay, the key to the victory at Yorktown. This was a clash between British and French naval forces. You can look at a whole bunch, and the website is listed here on the PowerPoint that's up on your website. Copyright laws don't let us reproduce the stories from the website, although there are some links to it. But we can show you some of these old paintings because that was a big job back then. You know, this is before newspapers and cameras and things like that. And Francis Holman made a painting of a battle of Cape St. Vincent. This is one that happened in January that year. And Thomas Looney, a painting of a battle at Dogger Bank against the Dutch fleet. Another guy does a painting at Louisburg, and another one at Grenada, and another one at St. Actually, this was a big battle. William Elliot made a painting of it. Thomas Looney made a painting of it. Thomas Whitcomb made a painting of it. Those 3 paintings to illustrate an important fact about history at the time. This also connects to what Dave was saying about Paul Revere in its own way. None of these paintings were eyewitnesses to the battle. In fact, they really paint very different types of battle. And then Richard Peyton-Scruggs did a painting of Cape Spartel near Morocco, and an unknown painter did one about the siege of Gibraltar, and Nicholas Pocock did one of Frigate Bay, and Guibert did one of Puerto Playa, and Dominic Serres did one on the Battle of Trincomalee. And to make any sense of these battles, I mean, all we've got is a whole bunch of paintings hanging in the wall about all kinds of ships. Admiral Hardy had 35 ships as part of the Channel Fleet. 17 of them were first-rate ships of the line. Gibraltar, Admiral Elliot had 12 ships. Porto Praya and Fort Royal and so on. And this is all part of that PowerPoint I showed you last time. That when Graves, with his 19 ships, only 5 ships of the line, that is the big ones, the ones with the 100 guns, he was sitting there, you know, pretty badly outnumbered by the French. Part of the problem was that British had a big fleet, but they were all over the world and they were fighting battles. Every single one of these battles was fought in the same year as the Chesapeake Bay battle. And they also had a whole bunch of slave trading ships. And they had some explorers going around the world, of which the most famous was Captain Cook. So the British Navy, the slave traders, and the explorers were active in many places around the world in the late 1700s. That required a lot of ships. The simple question is, does this quick peek at the British naval history make it easier to understand why impressing of sailors was even bigger issue than quartering of soldiers during the Declaration of Independence? And then comes the messy question. Were the American colonists really standing up against the might of the British Empire? And last week I had shown you, the summary about how these old paintings could be used as primary sources. But if you want to check our inference, we really look at other primary documents at the same time. And one of the most important primary documents was from the First Lord of the Admiralty to the commander of the North American station in 1778. This was a couple years before Yorktown. And he basically said, the object of this war has been changed, and the contest of America is a secondary consideration. Our principal object must be distressing France and defending His Majesty's possessions in other places around the world, like India and the Caribbean and Gibraltar. Basically, Montague was telling Howe, America is just not that important. We need the ships somewhere else, and you're going to have to make do. And the problem was he didn't have enough ships to make do. And as a result, he lost the Battle of the Chesapeake against the French. And when he lost that battle, Cornwallis's plan was to hold out at Yorktown until the Navy could come and he could leave. And when the Navy couldn't come anymore, Cornwallis couldn't leave. He was stuck at Yorktown, and an army of about 7,000 people was surrounding him. That army was about 2/3 French and about 1/10 African American. And there were a bunch of Polish and Germans and other people like that in on it, which is kind of what Dave said. We ought to make the point that this battle was the end of a long series of battles that were a whole lot more important. So yes, Yorktown was a turning point, but what made Yorktown possible was Kings Mountain in making it harder for them to recruit loyalists, and the Battle of the Chesapeake, where the French fleet defeated the British fleet. And when those two things happened, then Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown was absolutely inevitable. In other words, Yorktown was a whole lot like Saratoga. It's something that had to happen once the rest of the conditions had happened. And so with that, I will stop the share here and let's see some questions. Dave, any thoughts?
I'm good. I'll move over to the final couple of sets of activities here. First up, I wanted to say that I did get the expedition working. I forgot it was working where it was before. All of my tabs are down at the bottom. Phil and I have had a lot of discussions over the years about good design. And thanks to those discussions that I've had with Phil, I have notes for the creators of this particular website because everything you need is down here at the bottom. And in my head, I have put in my head that, oh, that's only if I want to check out who this is by. But in this particular case, this is everything I need. So you can either display this for students or you can, if you have the ability, if like a lot of ISDs have like the virtual reality headsets, I know ours do, that you can check out. This can also be a tour that they take that way, but it's just a little added bonus that I'm sharing with you guys, where you can like take kids into Independence Hall. So I click on this and there it is. And you've got your 360. You can click with your mouse and move it around. You've got your 360 view of what's happening outside of Independence Hall here, the day that this was taken, which is kind of a nifty thing. You've got the Liberty Bell with people's faces blurred out on that particular front. But again, you know, kids can take a look at that. What's truly nice is Assembly Hall, which is where you know, the Constitution was drafted. So this is a place that you can come back to next time, and you can kind of see, you know, first up how small it was, which is great for the story about how hot it was as well in July when the Constitution was being drafted. So not only were all the windows closed, but these folks were put into quite a small space here. But then the part of it that's relevant to this unit, Old North Church. So when you do the Longfellow poem and you do the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, you can actually take students street side to the Old North Church and show them where, you know, the candle, one if by land, two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore shall be, was actually done. So this is free, and it can just be a quick little throwaway at the end of a class period if you wanted, but it's free, and I will put the link to this particular, it's a free account. You do have to sign up, but it'll be a free account. I will put it in the write-up that includes, you know, hey, everyone, the next video is up. So look for that in that video. And now I'm going to kind of walk us through the final little sets of activities here. After doing all these nice Revolutionary War pieces that Phil has done here, we've got an opportunity to kind of bring kids through the legacy of the war. And you're going to look at this presentation and you're going to go, oh, wow, 7 slides, Dave, plus title. That's super meaty. But it actually is because it's an opportunity to really have some discussion with students using the presentation as a guide. So if you're following along at home, which you all are, you'll begin by getting a blank sheet of paper out. And if you would like to do this, you can grab you can just even open up a new Google Doc window or anything like that. But just asking kids again, and I'm asking you guys again, if the compelling question is revolution ever justified? Take a second to think about what your answer to that might be now at this particular point. And then think about what students you might get or what answers you might give, and think about what answers your students might provide here. And just take a second thinking about what your students might say to "Is revolution ever justified?" Either unmute or drop in the chat what do you think some of the arguments that they might make might be. So take just a second to think and either unmute or drop in the chat what you think students might say at this point in the unit, towards the end of the unit, on whether or not revolution is ever justified. So I'm going to give you about 10 seconds of think time. All right, now if you want to throw your answer into the chat. Patty says, thinks most students would say yes. All right, thank you, Patty. Beth, that's a great answer. Yes, because if the laws aren't fair, we need to kind of push back against those. And I think fifth grade teachers I do a really good job of juxtaposing this against something that might happen in school, like an unfair rule in school. What are some ways that we might be able to address that? Like your paper thing from earlier, or like the Mrs. Mulder lives in the Johnson household now because of the extra educational activities and the need for the district to save money. But Leslie says, I think most students would say yes as they think about me coming to stay at their house. Great minds there, Karen. Sorry, great minds. Let's see, Leslie, Net. Goodness, my brain is fried, folks. I'm sure yours are as well. So Mary Sue, I agree. My students would say yes because others would control you. Mrs. Mulder, I agree. They would say yes. They don't agree with what was going on. I did pretend to have to live with a student last year, and it was a great example to use. Nice. Nice, nice, nice. Okay. Excellent. Okay. So basically, we have some deeper dive activities on the Treaty of Paris in here as well. But this is an opportunity to kind of preface it with kids. So you will introduce this as the treaty to end of the Revolutionary War, although there have been multiple Treaty of Parises. What is the plural, Phil, of Paris? Paris? Treaty of Parises? Treatise of Paris? I don't know. I'm gonna stop there. I'm just gonna keep going with what I was gonna do here. The random thoughts that wander through your brain while you're doing a Zoom call with folks. So the first major provision that the in the Treaty of Paris that we have students look at is the fact that Great Britain had to acknowledge that it was, no longer in control, that the United States was now fully free from Great Britain, and that it is an independent country, no longer under its control. And as part of this, you'll see we gained a lot of additional land. So if you're taking a look at my screen here, you can see this map. And basically, with the Treaty of Paris, everything that's in green on this map is now is now the United States' possession, at least in terms of what they got from the British. So we've been focusing this course on a very narrow, skinny stretch of the East Coast, and now the size of the United States has nearly doubled. It will double again in the early parts of eighth grade when we add the Louisiana Territory, most of which right now is the orange area, and that ownership would first transfer over to Napoleon and the French before it became ours. And I know Phil's doing some research on that right now for I can't even remember what you're working on, that we were talking about this the other day, but Phil noted that when we went to buy Louisiana, we just wanted Louisiana, and Napoleon was like, "Yeah, no, you're gonna buy all of it. You get to, this whole thing is now yours." So we are doubling the size of the United States here, and in eighth grade, we double it again with the addition of that. So now thinking about the Treaty of Paris, and the question, is revolution ever justified? What might this large increase of colonial territory mean for the Americans? What might it mean for the British? So this is another question that you will ask your students, and you'll give them some time to pause and think. This is a great opportunity to employ a turn and talk with them. Think first on your own, and then have a chat with your neighbor, and then let's talk about this whole group. So then we get into uh, basically we get into fishing rights, and this seems like a silly thing to stipulate in a treaty until you remember what particularly about New England and the growing season. Who remembers why fishing would be such an important activity, particularly for folks in the Northeast? Absolutely. I saw people mouth. Basically, it's the soil, the cold winters, rocky soil. Those are the things that are going to come out here, and so fishing rights are necessary in this because people in New England got to eat, right, Phil? So that is covered here, and those are the things that we hope your students remember from some of the early units to come back here in terms of why that was directly stipulated in the Treaty of Paris. We also end up with repayment of debts. Not to both sides things here, but let me pause for a moment to both side things here. Both sides in this struggle incurred a lot of debts, from the oppression of sailors and ships, which Phil talked about a little bit about, to disrupted resource shipments, and of course the loss of life and property and all of that. So both sides agreed to repay the debts that they'd incurred as part of this. And so that's an important part of this, for kids to take a minute and pause on and think about and go, okay, why is that important? But then you also get to note that the United States did not live up to their end of the bargain in this either. So we agreed to repay our debts, but we did not actually repay our debts. So, yeah, there we go. And then when we get on to the last part of the Treaty of Paris here, as I switch my slides, um, it was agreed that the British would return any runaway slaves that they had captured, to the families or the masters or the colonists that, used to own them. And so it's good to have a conversation here with students about why this might be an important part of the treaty itself. So again, give students an opportunity to think about this. This is going to be a little bit of a harder question for them. But again, the key word here is, why do you think returning slaves would be an important act for the British to do? And the reason why this question is here is because the entire eighth grade course is devoted to this kicking of the can down the road. So with the Constitutional Convention that you'll learn about in the final unit, we, do not solve the issue of slavery. And as the issue continues to develop over time, it's something that leads to the Civil War in eighth grade. So returning runaway slaves would be an important act for the British because slavery is an important part of the Southern culture at this particular point in time. And we would actually go on to outlaw the importation of new slaves a little bit later in United States history. So people are definitely going to want their slaves back. So getting into the overall legacy of the war, lots of different estimates on how many people we lost over the course of it. Some estimates say close to 26,000 Americans died, and that's a large number for that time period. But most of the estimates that I've been able to find, and I actually spent a little bit of time over the last week trying to come to some sort of consensus, and there doesn't appear to actually be one. We lost anywhere between 1 to 10% of the population. So this is a hard number to categorize because records were not quite as good back then as they are today. If it were 1% of the population, so let's say that comparatively today, that would put us at about, if this had happened today and we lost 1% of our population, that would put us at about 2.5 million dead. So does that number sound big or small given the population of the US today? We've got about 330 million people. and 1% of that is 2.5 million. So if 26,000 Americans is 1% of the population at this time, what do you guys think? Drop in the chat. Does that number seem large or small to you? Overall, I think anyone who loses anybody, it's a loss and that loss is felt. 26,000 doesn't seem like a lot, but given how many folks, given how sparsely populated, shall we say, the United States was with colonists at the time, it's a large number. It's definitely not a number to scoff at by any sense of the word. So, all right.
Especially,
Oh, go for it, Phil. No, please.
especially when you consider what age group that was.
And what age group was that, Phil?
Well, it would be the kind of people who were standing up in battle and therefore likely to be the ones who were the primary workforce at the time. Um,
I didn't know if you had anything else you wanted on that. That's why I paused.
well, it also would point out that the numbers on the British side were low because Washington really went out of his way to minimize battlefield deaths. He wanted to have most of the battles be sieges where people simply surrendered before they started fighting him seriously. And it's partly why he set up Yorktown the way it was, you know.
Also have to say on that same note, Phil, since you brought it up, do not ever disparage Hamilton in my presence, please. I have the whole set of these above my desk right now, so I walked right into that one. So, so 1,400 people were categorized as missing, over 8,000 wounded, and some of those wounds weren't mere flesh wounds either. It's just and all of this is the total number recorded. So thinking about the death count and thinking about the numbers, and a lot of you threw in the chat that you felt like these were large numbers. You know, can you win a war with numbers like that? Yes, we won the war, but when you start to talk about the human cost, this is another discussion point for students. Does the death count justify the reward of winning for the Americans? Why or why not? So in the next unit, we're gonna end up talking about and setting up two different systems of government in our newly freed territories. Spoiler alert, I'm saying two because the first one failed miserably. So this is going to be a question to sort of end this unit with students. So we set up the first colonial government and it lasts for a little while, but then it collapses and then ask students, okay, so would that collapse of that first colonial government be a good thing for the British or a bad thing for the British? Why or why not? What do you think? And it's not a question that we really answer, but it's a good question just to kind of take the pulse of where your students are and what they're thinking on this front. So, and that's going to be the lead into the final unit, which we will come back and do in April. So, that is Unit 6 in a nutshell. If you've been paying attention to my tabs as I'm closing them, I am out of tabs to close at this particular point in time. We do have an assessment for this one, and if I get into it really quickly, remember the assessment folder is linked at the top of the agenda. And you can always email me if you need it directly as well. But we do have an assessment for this one, and it's very Revolutionary War heavy, obviously. We have an opportunity I'm bringing this up again because these same item types will pop up on the M-Step. So if you haven't been utilizing some of our assessments, the previous unit and this one might be good ones to start because, again, we've got some drag and drop questions on American and British advantages during the war. One thing you won't see on the M-Step is the ability to actually write an essay. I would hope someday we could bring that back because you get better knowledge of what students know and understand from that. But, we are able to do some of those. We've got some primary and secondary sources for kids to explore as part of this. So we get into that historical thinking piece. We have, from the activities on women and Indigenous people and African Americans and foreign powers, which were some of these things that all of these different groups did to contribute to the war itself. We also have this timeline, which should mirror very nicely a timeline your students create as part of the opening lesson Giants activities. And we ask them to sort of interpret what's happening here. And then we close with the question, is revolution ever justified? So again, really good, strong inquiry question you should revisit and come back to on the assessment. And we definitely do that here. So you will read however many students you have. If you have 30 students total, you will read 30 different versions of this essay and they will all highlight and come into different things. What you as the teacher are of course going to be looking for is, do they make their claim on whether or not revolution is ever justified? And do they support it with evidence? Just like we do in our literacy block, just like we do in our ELA block. So um, all of that encompasses unit 6 of 5th grade. And like I said, when we come back next time, we'll do the final unit, which is creation of the Constitution and the start of the new republic. But what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to stop recording because I'm going to close us out in just a minute after I, open up for the hour of questioning that we will continue on after this.